Welcome to the second Norris lecture, and I'll talk more about the Norris lecture and where it arose very shortly. But I'd like to begin by welcoming you all to country. So I would like to wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. And I would like to acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who may be attending today's event. So, welcome. My name's Ross Thompson. I'm the Chair of Water Science in the Institute for Applied Ecology. And the Institute for Applied Ecology is an institute which has had a long association with water research, water policy, right back to the time of Peter Cullen, who's a famous figure in water science in Australia, and then moving through to Richard Norris. And this is one of an annual water science lecture that we give to acknowledge Richard's contributions, and I'd like to particularly welcome the Norris family who are here with us today. So Richard Norris, as many of you will know, was one of Australia's and one of the world's leading freshwater scientists, particularly in the area of bioassessment. And one of the things that Richard was particularly passionate about was about taking that ivory tower science, bringing it down and applying it to real-world problems. And that's very much what the Institute is about, and it's very much what the University of Canberra is about. It's about having a real impact that deals with real-world problems. And so, for that reason, it's very appropriate that the speaker that we have to give the Norris lecture this year is LeRoy Poff. And this is LeRoy with Richard in the field, I think in 2003, net in hand, two professors trying to pretend that they still get out in the field together. There we go. That's a classic image. So it's a great pleasure to introduce LeRoy Poff, and it's going to be a long introduction, but then it's a very, very long CV. So you'll excuse me if I spend a little bit of time on LeRoy's achievements. So LeRoy Poff is from Colorado State University. He studies the role that environmental variability, especially flow regime and its modifications, have on ecosystem structure and function. His research has ranged in scale from grazers on a single rock all the way up to global meta-analyses and all the scales in between. So he has an amazing CV which is stretched over all of those scales of operation. He received his Master's in Environmental Science from Indiana University, his PhD from Colorado State. He went and did postdoctoral work at University of Maryland and a number of other things before he returned to Colorado State University in 1997, where he has been since. He's had research funded by NSF, EPA, USGS, USFS, and the state of Colorado. He's served on a huge number of scientific advisory panels on a range of projects at the interface between ecology and hydrology. He is the past president of the North American Ecological Society, now the Society for Freshwater Science, which is the largest freshwater society in the world, and that's a measure of the esteem in which LeRoy is held by his colleagues. And he's a recognised global leader in hydrology and ecohydrology, and I could list the huge number of countries at which he's been invited to speak. He's perhaps most famous for establishing the idea of a natural environmental flow framework, the idea that we should be seeking not just to restore rivers, but to restore rivers in a way that restores their natural hydrology. LeRoy has one of those CVs that makes me wonder what I do with my time. It's very humbling to read his CV. He's published over 200 papers in the area of water science. His most cited paper has been cited over 4,000 times. He has a paper which has been cited more than 3,500 times, sitting close behind. He has 10 papers with more than 500 citations. So it's an amazing record. Unsurprisingly, therefore, he's an ISI highly cited researcher. He's also a fellow of the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program and elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. For those of you who worry about such things, and academics tend to, he has an H score of 58 and an I-10 index of 96, which are very large numbers. Now, all of these reflect the academic influence that LeRoy's work has, but I think one of the things that particularly excites us about having him here today is that he's also been really serious about engaging beyond the academic sphere and into making a real difference in the world. That's evidenced by a variety of outreach activities into non-governmental organisations. He was a senior scientist for Trout Unlimited between 1996 and 1997, and he's on a range of technical and advisory panels for American river programs. He's also been involved with the Nature Conservancy through its freshwater initiative and as a scientific and advisor and mentor in the David Smith postdoctoral program. So if I can quote from his online bio, and let's face it, what I've just said was completely stolen from the internet. To effectively achieve river conservation, Professor Poff promotes an evolution within the culture of academic science. Not only must scientists become more comfortable with using qualitative knowledge to inform decision makers, but they must also more actively participate with non-scientist stakeholders and the general public in the process of river conservation and restoration. And so those values are very close to the values that the Institute and our university has about taking the very best academic science and taking it out to social and policy contexts so that we can make a real difference in the world. And with those values in mind, it gives me really great pleasure to invite to the stage Professor LeRoy Poff.
Well, thank you, Ross. I'm rather speechless after hearing that, and I'm wondering whether you have the right speaker here for the day or not. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be here and give the second Norris lecture, and very nice to see Ursula again. This picture was taken in 2003 when my wife and my 2, 3, almost 4-year-old children traveled through from Sydney to Albury and spent a night with Richard and Ursula, and saw all the wonderful playgrounds of Sydney, which I have not revisited in the intervening 12 years, but there's some wonderful playgrounds there. And so for you, Ross, I mean, if you live long enough, you could be highly cited, okay? So that's something you should, but you have to do it on a continuing, weekly and annual basis. So anyway, seriously, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to interacting with more people. I've been having a very nice time so far, and let's see, we've got some multimedia going here. So what I'd like to do today is talk about sort of the future of rivers in what I'm going to call the Anthropocene. This is one of those terms that has now been widely adopted, recognizing the indelible footprint of humans on the environment. And I'll sort of frame this around climate change. Climate change has become obviously one of the most pressing issues of our time, and it's evidence that humans are changing the world globally in ways that we haven't done before, but that climate change is piling up on top of a bunch of impacts that have already accumulated. So global change is accelerating. This is a slide that depicts the Anthropocene, as it were, and I've got a pointer here somewhere. Here we are. All right, so basically this slide shows, with a number of curves which are unnamed, variety of changes that have occurred on a global scale in the last 200 years or so, and this ranges, what we see is this great acceleration occurring around 1950. Around the time most of us in this room were just becoming alive. Most people in this room were born after 1950. Maybe. And what we see is this rapid change in all kinds of things, the rate of nitrification of global waters, population growth, deforestation, it's a really dramatic signal, and it's having large effects globally. This map shows just some of the interconnections between major traffic interconnections around the globe. So as a freshwater ecologist, freshwater ecologists have a lot to worry about, because if we look around in our backyard or globally, what we see is that the world is changing very rapidly. And this curve over here on the right shows sort of an index of species health, and what we see is that freshwater species are declining in population abundance and diversity at a faster rate than other major ecosystem types, okay? And we expect in the future, these estimates are difficult to come up with, but 10 to 20,000 freshwater species are extinct or imperiled, and that many equally are largely undescribed as well. So we have a vast undescribed freshwater fauna which is going extinct very rapidly, and that's one cause for great concern from a conservation point of view. And another cause for concern is that ecosystem goods and services that are provided by freshwater, such as fisheries production, are under threat globally, and we aren't really adequately accounting for the economic costs of modifying river systems to the point that they don't provide these goods and services. And that still remains a huge intellectual challenge, and it's confronted by sort of putting ecological values on the same scale as economic context, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So these are things that I worry about, a lot of people in this room probably worry about as well. So what I would like to think about, given that the world is changing, it's continuing to accelerate, we have already degrading systems, and what can we do how do we move forward into the future and make the best possible world that we can, given these serious constraints that we're operating under. And I'm going to be speaking mostly from the perspective of a scientist, so I understand that the role of science is to inform society about the consequences of different options that we might make, and to understand how nature works is key to doing that. So a key premise that I would start with is that if we want to support functional and self-sustaining ecosystems, then we need to know how they work. We need to understand the processes that generate the structure and the function that we observe and that we value. And we need to understand how resilient these systems are to these projected changes that are coming, so that we might take some action or mitigate or mediate that impact. So that's obviously a huge challenge, and there's no way to sort of one person could really describe how that would be done. So my approach has been, with that sort of motivation, has been to think about one particular environmental driver that's very important to understanding the structure and function of riverine systems, aquatic and riparian systems, and that's the flow regime, okay? I'll come back to that in just a moment. This is just a little spaghetti diagram of sorts, box and arrows, where everything connects to everything else, and so there are lots of things that are driving down biodiversity, ecosystem function globally, and I just want to focus on flow modification, okay, and that's, I think, a pretty important one. It's a hard one, it turns out. So flow, the amount of water and the timing of water and the quality of water in some sense, moving through a river channel is key to many, many processes that we are concerned about in river ecology. And flow interacts laterally, longitudinally, it connects upstream, downstream systems. We get flow from vertically from the main channel down through the through the hyporheic zone, lateral exchange with the floodplain. So this is a very sort of key driver of ecosystem function, but it's also very multifaceted, and there are specializations that arise within just one of these arrows. There are many people who focus on just particular pathways here, if you will. So I want to try to just, I don't really want to emphasize this except to say that flow is clearly a very important variable in understanding how rivers function. So as Ross mentioned, almost 20 years ago now, I guess, I wrote this paper along with several colleagues, including David Allen, who I was doing a postdoc with at the University of Maryland, and essentially arguing that if you want to maintain healthy functioning riverine systems, then we can't just focus on the minimum flow, which is what was sort of the modus operandus in the US and elsewhere for that matter, But we need to think about the whole range of flows and what that variability means for supporting a diversity of processes and ultimately species, if you will. So very simply, this idea posits that the structure and function of river ecosystems and many adaptations of constituent species are dictated by the pattern of temporal variation in flows. And if we, this is like a 1990s vintage, slide here, which is really sort of simplistic, but the idea, of course, is that flow regime is something that influences these other drivers, and together they influence ecological integrity. Whoops, that was supposed to be gone. So we'd like to say that we can think of this flow regime concept as just like every region has a climate, every river has a flow regime, and these flow regimes can be similar or variously similar to each other across space. And it's driven by a lot of this variability that we observe. For example, this is a stream in the center U.S., it's sort of intermittent at times, and other times it's flashing like crazy. Has a very erratic and sort of unpredictable kind of flow regime. And if we think about this sort of logically, we can break down the pattern that we see into a number of components, if you will, that have some ecological relevance, such as high flows, low flows, the temporal variability in highs and lows. And so a lot of the work that I've done over the years has been to look at these patterns and characterize them in terms of things like magnitude of flow, the frequency of high and low flows, the timing and the duration of those events, which obviously have ecological relevance, predictability, and even the rate of change, which can be very important when you think about hydropower dams and how they modify regimes into a really unrealistic or unnatural, if you will, rate of change. So just to give you an example, sort of the iconic example from the US about the relationship between flow and species performance is using the plains cottonwood, Populus deltoides. And basically here's a hydrograph, sort of a stylized snowmelt hydrograph, which is very just sort of the natural environment for these guys. And basically the peak flows create the habitat, scour the floodplain, create the clean habitat that then seeds are released during a window of time. This window, it's hard to, so during this period of time, seeds are released. Also at this period of time, water is coming off the floodplain and receding. The groundwater alluvial groundwater table is receding at a certain rate. The seeds are rafted up onto the floodplain and germinate, and then their roots are able to track this receding alluvial water, and so they become established. They recruit, and then ultimately persist if there's enough base flow. And this cycle sort of repeats, and so in this figure over here, you can actually see the parallel bands of different aged cottonwood trees that represent previous high flow events. As the channel's migrating, the cottonwoods are keeping up with it. So this is a very well understood example, and there are many other examples that I could mention, but I won't do that. I just want to make a point that in the US, for example, there are lots of different kinds of flow regimes. These have different magnitudes, frequencies, predictability that are in some sense represent climatic regions, but in some sense they don't. So for example, this one is very flat. This is basically the day of the year, fall out through winter and then summer. It's going back in time, and what we see is that there's very little variation in that system. That's a heavily groundwater dominated system compared to something like this that we saw before, which is very flashy, intermittent and perennial at various times of the year. And so the basic premise here is that these systems would function differently ecologically because this dynamic flow variation is differentially expressed across them. This kind of work, this classification work of flow regime types has been done in many countries around the world subsequently, and including Australia. So Mark Kennard at Australian Rivers Institute published a paper in 2010 where they did this for Australia, and Australia, of course, has somehow it came up with 800 plus stream gauges that were relatively unaltered, and I haven't talked with them about where those are, but these obviously smaller streams, okay, and what we see is just sort of, the details aren't really that important. I just want to point out that there's some regional variation. These are all sort of base flow, sort of perennial streams, and we see that there's some that are stable in the winter, some are stable in the summer, some are unpredictable base flows, so there's a lot of nomenclature here. There's a whole bunch of intermittent types of streams, here unpredictable intermittent that occur right up the East Coast, and others, so all in all about 12 different classes of, flow regime types that presumably have some different ecological characteristics associated with them. All right, so that's the natural flows, and as we all know, most rivers and streams are not free flowing, and certainly, not in many in this region. The region where I come from in Colorado is also heavily modified. Actually, on a global scale, there are patterns that you'll see, but these dams that occur globally and are having tremendous effects on freshwater biota, not only because of modified flow regimes, but also because they fragment the landscape and prevent movement. But they do profoundly modify flow regimes. And if we sort of step back and look at the global scale at really large dams, on the order, of 1 cubic kilometer or more, each, there are about, 6,800 that are in, global databases. That's probably a pretty accurate number. These are easy to count. So, Australia, Oceania down here with 255, and of course southeastern and eastern Australia have the majority of those. Here's the moonrise over Hume Weir, so that's sort of a little nice picture. Also, pretty good sized dam. In the U.S. alone, we have over 75,000 dams that are greater than 2 meters in height, so my height and above. So, these large dams are complemented by a whole bunch of smaller dams on smaller systems. And in fact, I did a calculation that showed that in the U.S., on medium-sized rivers, that there is on average 1 dam every 50 to 60 kilometers. So across the entire U.S., okay, and that's, of course, they're not evenly distributed, but that's a sort of a bit of a startling number. Now, a lot more dams are being proposed. This is work that's just been published by some colleagues in Germany that shows the planned and under construction hydropower dams exceeding 1 megawatt of generation capacity right across the globe. And of course, what we see is that in Australia, U.S., Europe, places that already have all the big dams, there aren't a lot planned of this scale, but in South America, the Andes, Western Africa, the Fertile Crescent area, along the front of the Himalayan front, there's a lot of gradient, and of course China, there are lots and lots of new dams proposed. And I haven't gone into a whole laundry list of all the ecological impacts of dams, but we know a lot from our having built these dams in the 20th century. We did sort of grand experiments on river systems. They weren't posed that way. They were posed as economic stimulants, and in some cases they were, clearly. And water supply and a lot of economic benefits occur from these dams, but there were have been a lot of unintended ecological consequences, and it's hard to fix these consequences because the dams are sort of the way they were designed and not the way they're operated. But large-scale restoration is one way that we're trying to fix some of those consequences, and that's expensive and not always possible, depending on the outlet structures from the dams. So, anyway, can we learn from those lessons in the developed world from the 20th century? Can we learn things that can be exported to the developing world as they build new dams? That's part of the motivation for what I'll tell you about. All right, so dams involve trade-offs. We all know that. And a lot of things. My favorite part of this figure is displaced people protest. Doesn't get a lot of press, but it's a very important social consequence of building dams, and it happens a lot. I'll focus on environmental flows over here. And environmental flows, I realize, is something that is it's a very well-known term in Australia, particularly this part of, in this part of Australia. So I'll be saying some things here that you're obviously aware of, and it's really one of the fun things to be here is to interact with people who know a lot about environmental flows and who've thought about it quite a bit. So basically, flows are altered by dams in sort of predictable ways. Dams are built to store floods, and they do a good job at that, and store water. So here's a pre-dam hydrograph, the Colorado River, below Glen Canyon. Lots of big annual peak flows. The Colorado was named Colorado, the red color, and now with the placement of this dam, all the sediment's captured behind the dam, and it's green, and it has much lower peak flows. So this is a highly modified river. We really can't go back on this river. This river it's been estimated that the concrete in that river would last 10,000 years. So, on that dam, I'm sorry. The Flaming Gorge on the upper Colorado, I just want to show this little graph. It's basically, we can see the annual differences in peak flows. There's also seasonal variation. Before the dam, which went in right here, we see that we had high winter flows from snowmelt, and then a long period of low flows in the late summer and autumn and over the winter. And then the dam was put in, and so basically the peaks were brought down and the base flows go up. And so we've tremendously modified the habitat dynamics for the species that live in that system. It's been pretty well documented that environmental flows have an effect, okay? And I did a survey with a postdoc a few years ago in which we looked at a global survey of literature from around the world, trying to ask the question, can we look at these studies and come up with some kind of general relationship between flow alteration and ecological response? Of course, these studies weren't designed to answer that question, and there's a lot of noise in those relationships just from the literature, and that's not surprising perhaps on such a scale. I would say that, I've done some work with a couple of colleagues down at Melbourne Uni, Angus Webb and Mike Stewartson, and they've applied some of this lines of evidence approach that Richard Norris, helped develop to try to get more, a little more fine-tuning on that question of, what is the evidence for flow alteration affecting ecosystems in a published literature. So if we know something about the relationships between the flow regime and ecological process, then we're in a position to to understand, to make some predictions. And I want to give you an example here of, again, in the desert southwest of the U.S., cottonwoods occur very heavily along unregulated rivers. Some big dense growth of cottonwoods here, but also in this system, you see there's some smaller trees in here as well. These are invasive salt cedars, tamarisk, okay? And if we look at a natural hydrograph here, as I showed you before, then that is conducive to the recruitment of cottonwoods, this little recruitment box here. So cottonwoods do what under a natural regime. If we push that flow peak later into the season, then we miss this window, and cottonwoods don't recruit very well, but this creates an opportunity for this other species, tamarisk, to come in, and it can just completely dominate floodplains and regulated rivers. And I did some work with a postdoc several years ago, which we did a survey across the Southwest, and we saw that if you look at an index of flow modification, and this is mostly magnitude and timing, that unregulated systems down here have a lot of cottonwoods up here, but as the regulation increases, cottonwoods drop off dramatically, and tamarisk comes to dominate these rivers. And so the message from this study was if you want to have coexistence of these two species, then you need to basically restore something about the natural flow regime that gives the cottonwood an advantage, because they can only coexist under low levels of flow modification. And adding a little bit of water to rivers can help. So this is a picture of sort of a geriatric cottonwood stand in the Truckee River in California, Nevada. And this is taken in the winter, so the trees don't have leaves, but you can see there aren't any small trees on that floodplain. And an experiment was done by Stuart Rood from Canada, and basically they had water was intentionally released from an upstream dam at the right time of year, seedlings recruited, saplings established, and eventually you had stands that looked like this. So we basically, with one watering event, recovered a lot of ecosystem function. And of course, this would have to be repeated at some point in time, right, in the future. Okay. All right, so there's a lot of concern about these ecological impacts, however well understood when dams and other water infrastructure modify natural flow regimes, and about the cost of this modification to human well-being. And so I was lucky to be part of a conference in Brisbane in 2007 that issued what's referred to as the Brisbane Declaration, and basically gives a definition of what environmental flows are, at least sort of in a modern context. And I think the important point here is that we have both this sort of natural flow regime elements, but we're talking about importance to ecosystems and human livelihoods. And in some places, that importance to human livelihoods is much more apparent than it is in sort of the developed world. But I think in the Murray-Darling, it's pretty clear that environmental flows are also important to human livelihoods. So in the U.S., sometimes we struggle with that because it's not entirely, we don't have one major river that's a breadbasket, for example. And so the simple cartoon version for policymakers and those spreading the word through outreach is something like this. That's what environmental flows are. So water quantity and timing and quality that's critical for human well-being and ecosystem well-being. And of course, that's going back to the trade-off picture about dams. That's it's easy to say, right? But it's obviously a long process to actually get these environmental flows defined and implemented. It's becoming a very well-developed practice, and there's more science is developing around it. Angela Arthington at Brisbane has published a book on environmental flows. So I think the framework for environmental flows has become fairly well established. The implementation, which I'll come back to in a moment, is more of a challenge. Even the World Bank has issued publications on the importance of considering environmental flows in the context of building new dams. And as I'll mention at the end of the talk, I think they're returning to this in a more serious fashion. So it's easy, it's easy for greenwashing to occur, right, and all that kind of thing. But I think the World Bank and others are now becoming more serious as we move into this new era of dam building. All right. So one of the things that I got interested in as we were sort of struggling with environmental flows coming from different, coming South Africans, the Australians, people in the US, the Europeans, there are all these case studies that were emerging from the understanding of how environmental flows in a particular river have particular kinds of ecological effects. But, we, the global science community, realized that we can't take these case-specific studies that produce wonderful information and necessarily package those all up into a kind of recommendations to, ship around the world, yet all rivers and streams around the world are being heavily impacted. What do we do? How can we, the science isn't going to keep up with the rate of change in these river systems. So several of us got together and decided to create some kind of scientific foundation for assigning environmental flows to systems that we don't know much about, but maybe have some hydrologic data, maybe some biological data. How would we build a framework to promote the implementation of environmental flows at places where we don't have much information? So we created, we were interested in sort of these characteristics, and certainly being a science and social process as well. And so we developed this framework called ELOHA, the Ecological Limits of Hydrological Alteration. This has become very widely considered. It's a challenge to implement, but basically it addresses those characteristics I pointed out on the previous slide. And here's just a cartoon version that I won't go into great detail, except to say that it's sort of a scientific process. There's this, hydrologic characterization of stream networks in a river basin. Then there's a sort of ecological component where we try to make hypotheses, or we state our understanding of the relationship between flow and flow alteration and ecological responses. Okay, and that's where, usually we sort of draw the line there. As a scientist, I'd like to draw the line there and say, okay, I'm going to give you my information now, make it happen. And that doesn't seem to work because we need to engage social systems. So it's a social process. And in this paper, we sort of downplayed that. We didn't really go into great detail. But, because a bunch of scientists in the room, basically. But we all recognized that was important. And I'll come back. So, this ELOHA framework is being used in a lot of places, and I would say what's being proposed in the Murray-Darling is, in a sense, at the basin scale, is in a sense a kind of ELOHA approach. We want to have some kind of hydrologic prediction throughout the basin and an understanding of what the ecological response to adding water would be. And these are the endpoints, the ecological endpoints that are being aimed at. And I'm really excited to be able to go to the MDBA tomorrow and talk with people about issues around this. All right, so that was very sort of a thumbnail sketch of environmental flows, and you're all sort of familiar with that, and we know all the problems, we know it's a social process, but there's some real challenges. We've got, I think, pretty good scientific frameworks, and I like frameworks, but we're moving into a new time, and how are we? It's already hard enough to acquire environmental flows in our current world, but now we have climate change. People realize the future is not going to be the same as the past, so that's presenting even new challenges. And so certainly, with population growth and with, the increasing water stress and demand from population growth, this is going to make it even harder. And then, of course, climate change will even add to that. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what I think are the major challenges facing environmental flow science and the implementation of environmental flows, and then spend a couple of minutes talking about what I hope might be an approach to moving forward. All right, so the first challenge, I think, is that we need to make these e-flows more socially relevant. And there are people like Claudia Paul-Wostel in Germany and others who are basically trying to expand, blow up this social part of the ELOHA framework. And this was just one way forward in this sort of general approach. And I think we need to take into account things that matter for, like, the Millennium Development Goals and, Sustainable Development Goals, like poverty alleviation and human well-being. So it's a big challenge. I think environmental flows in the future is going to become much more integrated sort of between social and natural physical scientists. Another challenge is going from sort of a static view of environmental flows to a more dynamic view, because as climate changes, these systems will change. And this paper in Science in 2008 was sort of a watershed moment when a bunch of very respected scientists and agency directors said, the past is over. The future, this idea that we can predict what a 100-year flood is and that kind of thing is, we don't have any reliance in our statistical models anymore, because the climate is drifting in a way that's not cyclical like it was during the Holocene. So stationarity is dead. That was pronounced in this paper, and it's had a huge impact, particularly on water resources management and planning. Another sort of thing that happened, which about the same time, that is something we need to think about in environmental flows, is that ecological reference conditions are changing as well. And historically we've restored to the past to some reference condition or managed towards a reference, but as the climate drifts, the reference state is drifting too, and that sort of creates a challenge for us as ecologists. It'd be very interesting, and I would love to have a conversation with Richard about this problem, because he was very instrumental in sort of establishing the idea of reference condition. And this is sort of coming at all of us ecologists in a very sort of stark way. And I would just say that, going back to this slide for a moment, that this is important because if you think about setting some environmental flow levels based on some historic characteristics of the natural flow regime, then as the future changes, the historic range of variation in the natural flow regime becomes less and less relevant, right? Because we're drifting into a new space. Another challenge, I think, is we have to start thinking about more broadly about targets that we're going to manage for. And basically, we've done a lot of management for states. It's easy to think about ecosystem states. Much, a cottonwood forest, for example. That's what we want to manage for that. But we need to think about other factors as well, like rates, biogeochemical, or population demographic rates, or things that we could manage for as well. Traits, which I do a lot of work with traits, and so in the flow world, we've developed different kinds of traits that are relative to flow regimes, so they're both for riparian, fish, and aquatic insects. So these are sort of a nice, I think, a bridge between a state and a rate. These traits represent more of a sort of a process-based state, if you will. I'd be happy to, looking forward to talking about that more with people. And basically, the bottom line is we need a better process-based understanding of flow ecology relationships as climate changes, because we're going to be moving into areas that are outside of historical range of variation. Now, I want to sort of move towards a conclusion and take about 5 minutes that I think pretty self-evidently that the success of future freshwater conservation has to include and incorporate water infrastructure management, design, and operation. Because water infrastructure has such a huge impact on existing systems, and it's only going to become larger as more dams are built. And so the idea, okay, yeah, a little bit ahead of myself, but one question we have to ask now is, where are we going to put, where should our efforts be focused in order to conserve freshwater biodiversity? And, some other questions to go with that, but again, in the Murray-Darling Basin, I note some background materials that I was given. Now, the authority is asking questions about how do we do conservation planning at the basin scale, right? And I think this is a scale that's not really within the historical range of focus of environmental flows. It's been very site-based, specific piece of infrastructure, but as people like Ralph McNally and others would point out, we need to think about broader spatial scales if we want to conserve local biodiversity. So I think this is an exciting, new, challenging area for e-flows, and it's one way to make e-flows more generally relevant in science. And finally, this idea of managing flow for adaptation and resilience of ecological communities. And here again, we need to develop a process that can be wedded with development and management. Okay. And I think key components of this, managing for resilience will be things like identifying key processes and their range of variation that allows the system to not blink out when, as conditions change. And that's something that's really pushing us as scientists to really understand that. I think, we have to manage against conditions that can flip systems into, alternate stable states that it's very expensive and difficult to come out of. And then these other limiting factors, which we don't like to talk about, but just to remind you, I'm aware of them because they were in that spaghetti graph I showed you early on. But, this is something that is, again, pushing us as scientists, but it's an important part of managing for resilience. We might not necessarily want to manage E-flows below a dam that has very modified temperature conditions because of deep releases, right? That might be a environmental feature that trumps the need for water flow management. So I was recently asked to write this editorial for a journal in the Ecological Society of America. And, I was a little bit self-conscious about this because that's a selfie I took up in the right there when I was standing on a boreal river in Finland, and I was looking for a nice spot to get a picture because I had 2 days to finish this thing. And anyway, that's my chubby face up there. So I think as we become more and more accustomed to this idea that we're changing irreversibly, we have to think about what are we going to be doing, what are we going to manage for in the future. And it strikes me that these river systems, we used to think of them as dynamically equilibrial, but they're really dynamically evolving, and that again poses a big challenge for us as scientists. But I think this this poses it's an emerging research frontier, and there's a lot of questions to be asked, and I think there are a lot of really exciting research questions to ask as we move into this era of more coupled human ecological systems. And I'd like to just close with a notion that I think this rapid acknowledgement, this rapid recognition of climate change that's created sort of panic in the water management world, and it sort of coincides with ecologists realizing that our systems aren't referenced anymore, creates a real opportunity for ecologists and water managers to come together and try to cooperatively manage systems in a more resilient way. And investors and engineers are very concerned about how they design infrastructure because you can't make any assumptions about what the future hydrology will be in a catchment, all right? And there are also, many of them are quite concerned about the environment, realizing that we need to do things smarter in order to maintain systems in a way that can produce goods and services and not just only focus on the short-term economic benefits. And then we as conservation ecologists have the challenges. And so I like to pose the question, can ecological principles be incorporated into the design and operation of water infrastructure? And I became involved in a project with some people in the States and in Europe to sort of get at this question. It's a hard question. It's a hard thing to do because we really have sort of a clash of cultures. Engineers make assumptions about the way the world works, okay? And ecologists, we have our own set of assumptions there and sort of principles, and they're often conflicting, okay? So, having some kind of middle ground is a challenge, but that's what we need. I think we need to try to go there in order to have better management and ecological resilience in the future. So I'm just going to briefly give you a little formal process that we've been doing. Now, there is this idea about predicting, so the idea is we have some future climate uncertainty, how are we going to manage our dams, and how are we going to make sure that we have some ecological resilience under that in climate uncertainty. This is very different than assuming, we know what the future is and building a dam and then, having, sort of an expectation that the future will be the same. So this climate uncertainty is a really interesting challenge. And sort of we sort of think about top-down approaches to predicting sort of vulnerability of water infrastructure or ecology versus bottom-up. And I'm going to talk about this in just a moment in a little bit more detail. But basically, the motivation for this work that I've been doing with others is to try to incorporate ecosystem vulnerability to climate change in the water infrastructure design from the very beginning, as opposed to waiting till after it's done and say, oh, let's do an environmental impact statement and, no effect. Okay? So this work is being done through an NSF-sponsored center in Maryland, the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. It's run by Margaret Palmer. Some of you may know her work. And so we have a series of working groups there. It's built on the old model of NCES in Santa Barbara. And another sort of multi-institutional, international alliance that's co-led by a colleague of mine who's involved in this process. But this alliance involves World Bank, Corps of Engineers, OECD in France, other international investors. U.S. State Department has some representation in this group. So it's like willing participants who are concerned about this question of climate uncertainty. What does that mean for investment, for building reliable infrastructure? And then me as an ecologist, I'm like trying to sneak in so I can say, well, what about the ecosystems? Okay, so this is a really interesting sort of playing field to be involved in, but people are really interested in this, So here's our sort of typical approach is the downscaling. We take, some GCMs, up here, we downscale a few climate model projections that we think are appropriate for our region, and then we run it through a hydrology model, then maybe through a veg model, or maybe a runoff topography model, and then we come up with, maybe put some social system stuff in here. So we generate a few water supply series. So this is very very much focused on water resources here. And then you have some scenarios here, water demands. And then we say, okay, in the future, we have some climate space where we have temperature and precip. Okay, we don't know where we're going to be, but the GCM say we're going to be here, somewhere in this series of points. If we're in those series of points, will our system meet its needs? Will it be able to deliver water on a seasonal basis, or whatever you want your system performance to be? You can define it in terms of these models, and then you can see how sensitive it is to projected future climate. Now, a real problem that has stimulated the growth of this sort of our activity in this area is that if you look at downscale GCMs, they underestimate. So here's a graph that shows for 30 years of historic data, we can use GCMs to say what would the annual standard deviation of flow, in this case B, versus the annual autocorrelation. And what we see is here's the historic 30-year average. This little cloud here is the GCMs, what they say, and this bigger cloud here is a stochastic resampling of the historical variation. Okay, and what we see is that the GCM space is much smaller and it misses some of these, there's some really big deviations here. And so if you're a water manager and you want to know what's the risk to my dam 50 years from now, you probably want to have this, you don't want to necessarily plan based just on this GCM output. You want something that's a little more real time and maybe more informative. So basically, the point I'll make here, we can argue about it later, is that downscale GCMs fail to capture natural climatic variability that matter to managers, okay? And so this guy, Casey Brown, here at University of Massachusetts, has created this thing called decision scaling, where basically it's, as opposed to the top-down approach, it's a bottom-up approach. So you define some system component that means failure. My dam won't deliver water in July. And you say, okay, in a climate space, let's say this is temperature and that's precip or whatever, what is the vulnerability that my dam is going to be able to meet that performance criterion. And if you're out here in this part of climate space, it's really bad. Okay, if you're over here, maybe in the yellow or the pink, maybe that's okay. So then this bottom-up approach is then you map the climate domain onto this vulnerability domain. So here's the climate domain that represented that cloud of points, let's say, in the previous graph. So probably in the future, you're going to be somewhere in here, right? This is what the GCMs say. Okay, so if you in this cartoon example, but they're real examples of this. So basically, what this does, it allows you to define through a stakeholder process or whatever what your system performances are, and then look at how vulnerable they are to all kinds of information about future climate. Okay, and then you can determine whether your system is really at risk to climate or not, or maybe it's other things like population growth or other non-stationarity issues. So basically, then to close up, the idea that we had in this project is to say, well, if we can map an engineering domain for robustness or for engineering success, so economic engineering success, and in the same space we can think about where ecological systems will remain resilient. Okay, if there's overlap, then we can hopefully try to manage for something that's in this overlapping space. So this is very different than the traditional approach where we, after the fact, we think about ecosystems, and let's think about them at the front and make the trade-offs explicit as opposed to not thinking about the trade-offs until it's sort of too late. Okay, and we've worked up an example of this that we're submitting for publication in the next month or so. I don't have time, obviously, to go into that, but hope to talk about this some more in the next couple of days. I think this is really exciting. I think it's a really good way forward to get ecological principles embedded into into management context. Now, it may be too expensive to do. There will be an economic analysis of where we would operate in that space, but I think it's really important to make trade-offs explicit. And so this project that we're doing was just picked up recently, and it was a very nice two-page feature in Nature Climate Change. So I would encourage you, if you are interested in this, this reporter, journalist, did a very nice job in a really complicated subject. All right. So where do we go from here? Except I think we're going for drinks, right? Okay. Yeah. So I just close with this. I was really taken by the metaphor of the Roman god Janus, the god of transitions. We have a lot of things named after Janus, like January, the transition, between years. And basically, this is it's a two-faced God who looks to the past and looks to the future, and the past informs the future, right? And certainly during the Holocene, we're told that, certainly during probably the last, 150 years of modern science and engineering and statistics, the past is a good predictor of the future, okay? But now we don't know what the future, we recognize, we acknowledge we don't know what the future will be, but we know it's going to be different. So basically, from my perspective, Janus looks to the past. What we need to do as ecologists, as scientists, is to look back, understand historical range of variation. We need to understand pattern-process relationships in the context of that historical variation of things like flow and temperature. And then, in the past, we've done a lot of restoration. That's sort of been, but we've learned a lot from those restoration activities. And in the future, we're going to be faced with novelty, and we need process-based understanding that we gain from looking at the past, largely. And we'll be thinking about adaptive management for resilience. And so I think the past is really critical to inform how we develop those adaptation strategies but there's a lot of new work to do. And so I think, that this challenge that we're facing as we move into continue in the Anthropocene is it's a social and ecological enterprise. It's an opportunity. It's an enterprise that presents new opportunities for this, in the case of this audience, for university engagement and leadership. And, I hope we can, rise to the task and do the kinds of work we need to do in order to help move, ecological sustainability forward, because I think we're really at a critical era, a critical moment in time. So, with that, let's just say thank you and acknowledge, a few sort of key colleagues, and of course, including some Australian collaborators that I've worked with over the years that have been, influential in my thinking, and then of course funders, in case they're watching the video out there. So, anyway, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to talking afterwards. And I hope I didn't use too much of the drink time. Thank you.